afternoon to you, Leo. Great to see you. And you want to just tell us where you're zooming in from so people know where you're at in the world?
I am. I'm in northeast London in Walthamstow.
Great. Okay. So super excited to have you joining this series and speak on behalf of 59 Productions, this amazing polymathic organization of people, quite a lot of people, as we'll talk about, doing a lot of different kinds of things. Leo, you have a fantastic visual presentation to lead us through, and I think we should just go ahead and dive right into that. But I did want to mention to everyone, if you have a question for Leo, then please put it in the chat box as we talk, and we'll get back to it in the last 10, 15 minutes. And also, if you don't mind letting us know where you're zooming in from in the chat box, we always love to see that. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Leo.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Well, it's a real privilege to be asked to be part of this. And I think one of the key things that I just wanted to say is that you were generous enough. I dialed into your conversation with Gaetano on Wednesday, which was really fascinating, and were sort of generous enough to introduce me as the designer behind X Project, which kind of set me thinking, because I'm neither, I don't think, a designer anymore, nor I'm not entirely sure I was ever a particularly good designer, but what I am is privileged to be working with an amazing team of people, and here is most of them. In one of our more recent meetings, looking surprisingly chirpy considering the scenario. So I should say, all opinions my own, etc., but I am, in terms of representing the work, I'm speaking on behalf of the company that is 59. And this group of people and our sort of extended family of freelancers as well have this kind of shared identity that we have built over 15 years or so. And we ask this team of people, some of them designers, but many of them representing other disciplines, professions, and so on, to sort of incorporate their creative and professional identity under 59. So this is, in a sense, it's a great weight to try and speak on everyone's behalf. Also starting with this, I mean, we're all in this extraordinary place at the moment, which I don't want to go on and on about because it's such a big subject in so many ways, in terms of pandemics, in terms of the extraordinary political turmoil that's going on in the world. But for us, in terms of lockdown in particular, it's an opportunity, I think, for us a little bit to have thought very hard about who we are and what we do. And I suppose, insofar as I've got a thesis at all to talk about, like that's what I'd like to come around to. But if it's okay with you, Glenn, you asked me to cover a couple of individual projects. I've kind of worked a bit of a backstory together, which I'll try and whip through reasonably quickly, because I'm aware that there's quite a lot in here. But just going back to the origins of 59 Productions, started in 2006, and it was very much, those early years were very much about experimenting with what we call video design in theatre. And we devised, I suppose, a series of processes, some creative, some technical, some procedural, to incorporate in a sensitive way video into theatrical productions, into live performance, I suppose. The idea always being that what we were offering, what we were bringing to the production, was part of the design fabric, and also fundamental to the narrative, I suppose, and that's something which I want to come back to later. So we never were particularly interested in video as a pure expression of the form in its own right. We were interested in ways that we could layer video, often imperceptibly, sometimes not, but often imperceptibly, into theatrical, physical, live theatre environments, in order to build a living world to encapsulate those narratives. So this is a little snapshot. The first picture there was Waves, a show with Katie Mitchell that was at the National Theatre in London, came to America. The second image, I can't remember what it was, Warhorse, which came to Broadway, West End, and so on. Amazing collaboration between many disciplines, which really sort of opened up, I suppose, our eyes to the possibility of like multi-art form, multi-industry collaboration to tell really compelling stories for audiences of around the world, actually, many languages, many ages, and so on. This is an opera, Satyagraha, by Philip Glass, about Gandhi, which is an extraordinary piece, which came and again to English National Opera and the Metropolitan Opera, and first sort of brought us to the US. And then slightly different, something which came up later. This was a not great photograph, my own responsibility there, of a touring rock show for Yonsei, the lead singer of Sigur Rós, who released his own solo album. And this was the first time that we designed, I suppose, an entire production, having sort of built or layered our own sort of design input onto these theatrical worlds. This was one where we created the entire world and brought the whole sort of, I suppose, production design, creative vision for the show together into this kind of mutable physical space that was layered with light and projection and so on. That kind of covers, you'll be pleased to hear, the first 6 or so years of our work, and many productions in that time, but generally dealing with theatrical spaces, indoor theatrical spaces, dance, opera, ballet, theatre, etc.
Hey, Leo, can I just interrupt you quickly at this juncture and just ask you a couple of questions about that stage? One thing I'm curious about, which I'm sure a lot of people are, especially if they're students, is how in the world you came to be doing this in the first place. So how does one prepare for a career in this kind of field?
Well, I think now it's comparatively easy to identify like direct educational paths to doing. It depends what you mean by it.
Right.
I mean, there are many brilliant theatrical design, for example, courses. Many of those, I think, are starting to change quite rapidly. I mean, I've been involved a little bit with education the last few years. In fact, some of our team teach at educational institutions, some of our design team in particular, including, within architecture courses as well as within theatre design courses. And I think some of those courses are starting to realize that the thing that we've done initially kind of by accident, increasingly by design, of blurring the line between what's stage design, what's scenic, what's production design, sort of traditionally physical bit of that, with the use of technology, whether that's automation, whether that's projection, lighting, sound, and so on, that those lines are blurred, and actually blurred, I think, in practice quite a long time ago. And in a way that can sometimes happen, I guess, like the education of that maybe taking a little while to catch up. So you can still go and do a degree or a diploma or whatever in a specific area of what it's in some cases still called technical theatre, i.e. projection design or lighting and projection or something. But in order to kind of do what we're doing, you either need to collect those a bit or you just kind of need to do it.
Yeah.
And obviously the latter is easier said than done, but I think refusing to be defined by the slightly narrow channels of educational definitions of where those departments, if you like, the so-called departments in most theatres, like start and end, we just simply refuse to have that conversation most of the time now. It's like, well, either we are designing or we're not designing. What we're not doing is only designing a very small element, mostly.
And one other quick question: in these first years of 59 Productions activity, did you think of yourself as having quite a few collegial relationships with other firms that were doing the same kind of thing? I mean, I'll just speak from personal experience that I had the pleasure to see both Waves with Katie Mitchell, which is based on Virginia Woolf's novel, and Warhorse, the amazing production with the large-scale puppetry. And in both cases, I felt like I was seeing something the like of which I had never seen before in my life. And I wonder whether you had a very conscious sense of your firm as being a lead innovator at that time, or if it was more a matter of being part of a tide of practitioners.
I mean, we were maybe a bit myopic about sort of looking around the industry, but we were sort of fairly repeatedly told that we were one of a small number of people doing it well. I mean, that's, I suppose, true in any industry of any profession at the highest level, but we were very lucky in that we were sort of able to sidestep into the highest level because there weren't very many people doing what we were doing, I suppose, and doing it well. But I think this does come back to slightly to sensibility. There were many people, and have been for many years, doing amazing video, like, the film industry, for example, the television industry, computer games. But the sort of the integration of it into a live environment, with storytelling at its core, that spoke particularly, I suppose, to our interests and backgrounds. I'm speaking kind of on behalf of myself and Mark Grimmer, the co-founder of the company, who, we're both English graduates. I mean, I studied design before that, but I think the sort of literature story element, as any of our team who are on this call will know, is the thing that we kind of keep trying to come back to. Is like, what story are we telling? It doesn't need to be literal, but you need to be able to answer that question at some point towards the latter stages of the project, ideally in the earlier stage of the project.
Got it. Great, thank you.
No problem. So I'm going to jump ahead. 2012, as you'll have had the sneak preview, we were lucky enough to be asked by Danny Boyle, the director of many great films, and he just won an Oscar at that point for Slumdog Millionaire, to do the video design for the opening ceremony of the London Olympics. And we said no repeatedly, and he kept saying, come on, don't be ridiculous. And in the end, we realized we were being ridiculous. But he, again, was very keen. I mean, Danny's from he's had his time at the Royal Court and spent, his mode is story. And he's incredibly good at teasing out those narratives from all over the world and in all sorts of different ways. Like, his films are sort of wildly different to each other, and his work is sort of, I think, sort of admirably hard to pin down, I suppose. And he wanted, for whatever reason, he wanted us, because of our theatrical, we say theatrical sensibilities, that doesn't really mean anything. I think he just felt like he could have a conversation with us about what he wanted to say rather than what it was going to look like. And he would let us worry about what it was going to look like. And that was enormously liberating. But obviously it sort of pushed us in a new direction. It was a fantastic thing to have on the portfolio, but it also, I mean, just opened a world of discovery for us, things that we had to find out about and learn to do better and learn to do well. Many things about that I'm still only realizing, 8 years later. It's like, oh, that's why that bit didn't work, is because we thought it was for X, but actually it was for Y. And the really obvious one of those that I sort of realized on the night of the ceremony is we weren't making this for the 75,000 people in the stadium. We were making it for the TV audience. And it sounds so naive to say that now, but it's kind of true. Like, I sat there behind the program feed of the show and was like, it doesn't matter what it looks like out there, it matters what it looks like just here. The same time, we'd sort of split forces in the company. We were still very small. I think there were maybe 6 or 7 of us at that point, but we kind of split forces, and some of the team, not myself, were working on the design of the David Bowie exhibition, which, again, for sort of similar reasons, we'd never really done an exhibition at that point, in the way we'd never really done a ceremony scale event. And the reason that the V&A, and Glenn, you were there at the time, I think, so you may know more about this than I do, but the wanted us is because what the visionary curators, Jeff and Vicky, wanted from this wasn't what might sort of patronizingly, but potentially at that point at least reasonably accurately, be called a traditional exhibition with objects and photos and artifacts and stories on the wall or whatever. It did have all of those, but what they also wanted is for people to feel that they'd been to see a show in the sort of, block capital sense of the word, and that on some level they'd had a live experience, like an experience which moved them beyond just looking at artifacts and and reading about a story or being told a story, that they really wanted people to feel something within it. And so it led to us, I have to say, we worked with Real Studios on this as well, the original design, and we sort of sat somewhere between being the designers and AV designers and sort of, I suppose, design directors of it, although that wasn't the title, and came up with, I think, something, and I can, I'm very happy to talk about this in superlative terms, because I wasn't personally involved in this at all, really. Something which was able to take the ephemeral media, by which I mean the non-artifact based stuff, the videos, the music, the thing that it was really all about, that David's life was really all about, this sort of dynamic connection with an audience, with a listener, with an interviewer, with whatever, and render that into an exhibition form. So it was designed to be sort of larger than life, I suppose, in the experiential sense of the word. And so that was
this image.
Yeah. And and this is a useful image in a sense.
Really?
design point of view, because it combines the sense, like there were costumes on mannequins, absolutely. Some of those costumes are extraordinary, and they sort of defined how he, or maybe waymarked some of the incredible sort of characters that he invented and parts that he played throughout his career. So that it was fundamental that we got those objects in, like they weren't being diminished in any way, but really they were displayed with equal precedence alongside the work, by which I mean the videos, the concerts, and the music, most critically.
It really also helped you feel that the mannequins were manifesting him as a performer, because the surrounding aesthetic experience was so rich that you felt like he was in some ways kind of present in a ventriloquistic sense. And of course, it also helped that there was that positionally located soundtrack with their headphones, so they could sort of surf the show with their ears in a way, which was also very groundbreaking and quite amazing.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very important reminder, because the other thing about that is this show would not have worked without the sound. I mean, it was about, a huge proportion of it was about the music, about the sound, and so a realization that the sound design and the work that we were doing with Gareth Fry, the sound designer, and David's people in New York, who were remixing various things and creating new pieces of work to go into the exhibition. That was totally fundamental, and having to design the sound as a fundamental part of the design fabric of the exhibition was really interesting, because again, it's sort of an ephemeral thing. You can't put it in a case. So I suppose that sort of feeds into where the whole company trajectory took us, which is 1 year later. And in 2014, we were asked to make a projection piece for the Sydney Opera House, the Sails of the Sydney Opera House. This was an annual commission. In fact, I believe it still is an annual commission called Lighting the Sails for Vivid Live. And we'd been pretty sniffy about projection mapping, in a kind of, what we do is storytelling and not spectacle, I suppose, was one of the things we were liable to say to people at that point, and which is naive, but I think you're probably reasonably clear where that came from. And so we were given this opportunity, having done some projection mapping as part of the Olympics. We knew that it was actually creatively very interesting. So we sort of set out to say, okay, we know there's really interesting work to be done here from a design point of view. At that point, maybe define design slightly differently to how we do now. Let's work out what story we can tell. And honestly, I mean, the best thing that we could come up with was the story of the building, which again sounds incredibly simplistic and naive, but it's such an unbelievable building. It's an unbelievable fact that it exists at all, especially that it existed, it's existed for as long as it has. And we found these amazing archive recordings of Cahill, I think he was the one of the local politicians of the time, talking about when it was finally got through the local council system. Like, sounds like a man who sat through 48 hours of solid council planning negotiations, saying this is a real achievement. It's a building that's going to change the fortune of the city. And of course it sort of did, and it still stands out as this extraordinary landmark. So it felt really obvious to say, let's celebrate the building, let's celebrate the design process, let's celebrate the engineering process behind it. But we kind of went into the creative sort of first conversation thinking this was dumb and had definitely been done before, and it transpired no one had done that before. They'd done many very interesting, very beautiful things with it, but just exploring and venerating the building, weirdly, in my opinion, wasn't one of them. So we kind of just did that, and we showed how it was constructed. We showed how the geometry was calculated, the sort of its sections of spheres, as some of you will certainly know. And then the layers of engineering and fabrication stuff that went onto it. And then we kind of sent it off on this journey into the future, in which we kind of rematerialed it, if you like, and then kind of took it on this journey through time, which I suppose was, if you like, the spectacle bit, which also the local tourist board absolutely insisted on. But I felt like, we were able to give the building a life that was partly its own existing history and was partly our sort of own imagined future, but did feel like the building was at the center of it. And actually was very gratified to receive a very lovely letter from Jonutsen, the architect's son, saying that finally he felt that the medium of projecting on the building had come of age, which was very gratifying because I fell in love with it whilst doing it. So if it had been the opposite of that, that would have been truly upsetting. So, and again, sorry, this is more pictures than we probably need, but hopefully sort of feeds into where I'm going, which is sort of talking about how this journey that we went on, how we now try and describe what ties these quite disparate pieces of work together, and therefore what design means at 59. So these are sort of illustrations, pre-illustrations of that question. We continue to do projection mapping work. We've continued, I've thrown in Hampton Court here because it's the first piece where we said, okay, we won't just do the projection as we did at Sydney. We will also do the sound, we'll also do the production, we'll also do the lighting, we'll also do the pyrotechnics. Actually, I don't have a picture of the pyro in this presentation. But again, it was a 500-year celebration of the building. It's a celebration of its history, but also a celebration of the things that had happened there up to and including the present day. So it incorporated its use in the Olympics, its use as a cultural, in fact, historic royal palaces as a sort of active cultural maker of work, which they've gradually become over the last 10 years. And also need to touch on Edinburgh International Festival, where we've done a series of 4 opening events for them, all based around projection in some way, but Harmonium was the very first, led by my colleague Richard, and projection mapping onto the outside of a concert hall. Again, the sort of storytelling aspect of these is really interesting, because by this point we're getting into, as you can see, something which appears to be quite abstract visuals, although it's got the faces in there. The story in this case, and the narrative, if you like, in the loosest possible sense, actually started months before the show itself. And the story was about how the visuals, to some extent, and therefore the experience of the audience, was driven and mediated by the brain activity and other biometric data from the singers as they sang. So we did these 3D facial captures, but we also did ECG scans on them while they sang. We also did eye tracking things while they sang. And so the narrative of the piece, like the story of what you were looking at, only really, I suppose, fully made sense. Not quite the right word, but like came into its own if you followed a little bit some of the press activity before about the work we've been doing with Edinburgh University. And the various departments there that helped us sort of access that biometric data and turn that data into something that we could then visualize and so on. So you can probably see I'm sort of starting to get the gist of what I'm getting at, which is that our definition of what story was starting to evolve. And going to the complete other end of the scale, around about the same time, we were continuing to do scenic design, but did probably our first and maybe only, I think maybe one other example. No, actually there are a couple of other examples of a show where there was no inverted commas technology, there was no projection, there was no video, it was purely a physical sculptural form. So we're continuing to evolve that. And it's around about this point that we established the architecture department. And sort of taking all of that, gluing those things back together again, taking the idea of performance with performers and projection without performers, we had an amazing opportunity, thanks to Boeing Corporation, to celebrate their 100th anniversary, for which they gave us the most amazing theatre, which was their airfield in Seattle. And the planes were the characters. We were allowed, I think we were given at least 8 planes that we were allowed to move around and choreograph. Obviously not the easiest thing to do. We had a huge team of air traffic controllers and ground staff to move these planes around sort of on cue, and featured pretty extensive projection mapping sequences onto the planes themselves as they were moving, especially the 747, which was the kind of the iconic aircraft of Boeing's history. And again, we were sort of celebrating the aircraft, but we were also celebrating its part in various historical stories, like the complete change of aviation and global travel, the space shuttle that was carried up to the lower atmosphere on the back of a 747, that kind of thing. So a kind of amazing history of this sort of extraordinary scientific and engineering prowess of this huge group of people. And this was for essentially a closed audience, which was Boeing Corporation's staff, which of course number at that point about 100,000 people who came from all over the country to see it. So the focus on detail was absolutely fundamental, because we were sort of a bit like with Sydney, we were kind of showing the nuts and bolts of how these aircraft were built and how they were optimized and so on. Of course, the people who'd done that work were the audience. So our amazing team of video designers really drilled into getting that right. And this is the sort of, I think, last night's shot of our team sort of subsumed in the middle there of like the whole ground staff required, if you like, the stage management, if you were in a theatre, of how to get these actors, these sort of slightly truculent actors, in and out of position on their cues. So that's sort of the huge end of the scale at that point. I mean, physically large, I suppose. At the same time, we were doing the same thing back in the theatre. So combining all the things that we'd learnt, building architecture, working with architecture, but also using light and projection to transform architecture and making that into a living environment that could contextualize a narrative and or be a character in that narrative. So this was a production 59 sort of first self-produced piece of theatre, in that we initiated it, we commissioned the adaptation, I directed it, almost the entire company was involved in some way or another, both design, production, producing, technical management, etc., etc. This was essentially a built physical architectural set, but which was constantly projection mapped and could transform at the flip of a switch, if you like. So it was constantly transforming around the characters who never left the space. So that was a sort of waymarker for us in terms of many, many things. And at the same time, I sort of wanted to, this is a little bit relevant to the conversation you and I had the other day, Glenn, about what now, all these theatres are closed and so on. At the same time, my colleague Lysander, one of the other directors, made a VR spin-off. So he took a very small section of the show and turned it into an animated VR experience with 6 Degrees of Freedom headsets, in which you become one of the characters and you're looking at your own reflection. It's this young man who's been horrifically abused and sort of has become one of the major forces of the play, and you see him give this monologue, but you hear it as though you're speaking it yourself, and you're looking at your own reflection, which is sort of moving with you, which is extremely eerie. So that was a very interesting exercise for us, of like extrapolating a bit of narrative from, in this case, a theatrical production, and putting it into the context of a completely different medium, but using some of the same design assets. Like, it's the same architectural space, it's the same graphic design, it's the same projection mapping and so on. And these existed in the foyer of the theatre that the show was running in. So people could come in, see this thing, get this little, I suppose, critical bit of backstory or semi-critical bit of backstory, and then see the show, or the other way around. And then this is the sort of the last example of, I suppose, the work, this historical work, if you like. We then sort of amplified those lessons we learned in our own productions back into the stage. So this is Sting's musical, The Last Ship, the latest tour, not the Broadway production that was on, I think, maybe 5 years ago, but a tour we opened in Newcastle, which is the northeastern town, city in which, near which the narrative is set, where Sting grew up in Wallsend, Gateshead. And again, this is a sort of exercise in creating a very physical set, but which is transformable through the use of ephemeral fabrics and projection and lighting to radically change scale, perspective, and location in a really extreme way. And so this is something which sort of in recent years I've started to rather grandly refer to as like a kind of total design service, where we'll take on the whole design concept of a show and put together the whole design response to that. And in this case, that included bringing on board sound design, lighting design, and so on as well, and trying to make design as one process, as coherent as we possibly could.
Can I just make a quick observation there, Leo, which is these extraordinary images. This is not a production that I had the chance to see in person, but from the images, it looks like you're almost effacing the usually bright line that exists between the digital and the physical, so that they start to not only have a conversation together, which is true in so much of your work, but there's actually a kind of difficulty in pulling apart what's a physical object and what's a virtual.
Yeah, I mean, you would, arrogantly, you would really struggle to know at certain moments of the show which bits are you can touch and which bits you can't.
Yeah.
And it does change. There are some tricks, although not so much in this show actually. Like City of Glass, there were more tricks where some things physically changed and you couldn't work out really, because by that point you were sort of you just given in. But this one, it really was transformed primarily through changes in light projection, sometimes very subtle, sometimes really profound and epic. And in fact, there's a great story which I don't have time to tell really well, but about the brief for this show was that there was going to be no ship launch at the end of the show. And Sting, when he showed up to the first preview, was like, I'm really looking forward to the ship launch, to put it, to paraphrase. And we were like, right, okay. I'll just have a quick chat with the director. And by preview 4, we'd created a ship launch, which actually, I think, had we set out with that as our primary ambition, we'd never have done anything half as good as we actually managed in the final instant. The sort of final 10 seconds of the show is the ship going down the slipway, and it's pretty epic. So skimming ahead, so I guess by this point, this is sort of last year, 18 months or so on, we were starting to ask ourselves again if this statement was true. We've always talked about 59 as a design company. We've also said it's variously other things as well: production company, a producing company, which is slightly different, an animation company, etc., etc. But we were starting to say, does this define what we do? Where are we really putting our focus? Where are we, and why? And of course, by this point, we're dealing with many more people than we had all those years ago, which sort of prompted us, and particularly me, as the founder and sort of the original designer of the company, to ask this question, which I think is something that there is no one answer to, but we all in the industry should be asking ourselves kind of all the time. What can it do, and what should it do? Like, do we have a duty to do something with this tool that we call design? So this is sort of a bit of work, and it's massively simplistic in some ways, but about how we define who we are and what we do. Design, as we've defined it for now, and these things are always fluid, but it's the iterative process that we apply in order to interrogate creative ideas. So any creative idea, goes the hypothesis, we can feed through a process of design to come out with something. So it's, I think the key word there is process. It's not it's something which is iterative. It has to be iterative in order to generate good quality outcome. So to feed something into it, I suppose you could call that the creative idea. You feed an it into it, like the what's the idea? What are we trying to do? What's the problem that needs solving, if you like? And out the other end, you can get a thing, a product, a show, or whatever it is. And design is the kind of, I suppose, the thing which bridges the existential gulf between an idea and a thing. Does it exist? No, it's just an idea. It doesn't have form. It doesn't look like anything yet. It's not made of anything. And then a thing, it's like, where is it? What is it? What does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? So 59 is a design company because we do this process, but 59 is critically, and this is where our sort of, I suppose, growing up comes in a little bit, it's more than a design company. It's a responsive creative discipline. And whether or not art is a responsive discipline or pure and of itself is an interesting debate that we have frequently, not something we certainly have time for now. But the hypothesis for us is that design is always the answer to a question in some way, and or the solution to a problem. And if design is going to thrive, then you have to have certain conditions. So the input has to have a purpose. And for the purpose to exist, the sort of input has to be sort of nourishing. You have to be asking provocative questions. You need there needs to be a compulsion to have an answer. There needs to be some degree of inspiration behind it, and you need to be testing those underlying principles of that question. Is it the right question? Is that question exciting? And if that question isn't clear, the answer, again, our hypothesis is that the answer will never be meaningful. So when the conditions are met, i.e. it's got purpose, then the process of design will have a purpose. And then Secondly, the mechanisms by which the output is realized need to be absolutely rock solid. This is sort of, I suppose, what is good design is maybe the question here. And so the process of bringing design into the physical world is obviously fraught with practical and logistical complexity, as any designer will know, like actually realizing the thing that you have designed. And a clear and well-articulated design intention should be respected in that process of rendering it into reality. And a good design will remain flexible, through the process of realization. You'll need to make changes depending on what's feasible and what isn't feasible, what the budget is, and so on. And without the core meaning being lost, you should be able to apply a good process of design through a good process of realization. Both remain flexible, and then you end up with a good quality thing. And again, our hypothesis that poor design will never survive poor execution. But conversely, flawless execution won't necessarily guarantee meaningful design. So you can have really good input and really good realization, but if the design process hasn't been really high quality, then you won't hold the core principles sacrosanct. It won't necessarily yield a good thing. And then for all of that to happen, this is where we start to get into like why we exist as a company as opposed to a group of individuals. We have built this project structure around it, which is things like the project director, a role that I play frequently, as do a number of the other company directors. And around that is the company structure, which is the all of the other mechanisms that enable all of the people involved in all of those processes to do their work. And that includes producers, that includes management, that includes finance, that includes office administration, all of the key things running the studio. So we've sort of built everything between the idea and the product into the company, and that's sort of what we've decided we are. Like, that's design is at the center, if you like, but it only really exists and only really has a purpose of everything else.
I noticed it's also the largest circle on the diagram. Does that suggest that it's the arena in which you spend the most time and resource? Do you think that's fair?
That's a very good question. No, I mean, I think if you were to break it down departmentally, which we now do, there's a team of just under 40 people. Departmentally, it's probably just over 50% designers. But in terms of my time, yes, I think I probably spend more time on the company than I do on individual projects, unless I'm really, for acute periods, I'm really focused on the project. Because I think, apart from anything else, we're inventing it from scratch. None of us, actually that's not strictly true anymore, but like the original founders of the company have no business background nor previous company experience. Like, we did this straight off the back of leaving university or leaving education, whatever. And it's and so we're here through the process of sort of organic development and experimentation. Yeah, but it does require an enormous amount of thought to get it right, and we're definitely not getting it right. I feel like most organizations don't and may never. You can only sort of strive to get better at it. So I don't know if it's useful, Glenn. I was just gonna, so that's kind of, I suppose, a bit of history and then sort of a bit of thinking that's happened that's kind of pushed us off to where we are now. And if we've got time, I could just offer a couple more, I suppose, case studies, like our most recent work. Would that be useful?
Please, yeah.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief, because these are big projects. So these are things which happened really in the last 12 months. We were commissioned by the Smithsonian Institute and the National Air and Space Museum to do a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the moon landings, which we did on the Mall in Washington, and we used the Washington Monument as a projection surface. We also built these huge side projection surfaces here, and we had, I think, over 3 nights, I think I'm right in saying, about 500,000 people came down live to see the show, which happened repeatedly. And then on the second night, I think we synchronized the boots on the moon moment precisely to the sort of millisecond over the 50 years. So at exactly, I should know that, but exactly, 4 minutes past 11 or whatever it was, the Armstrong's boot hit the moon, and we matched that moment. And this is, I suppose I'm showing this because, again, it's an example of how all of the disciplines of the company came together to make a narratively driven, a story-driven event happen. And this involved huge amounts of animation, projection design, and so on, and all of the associated, therefore, research. And again, we were doing this for people who had been directly involved in the space program, amongst others, amongst the general public. So, we worked with, we put together a team of experts who could fact check. And, some of our team, I'm thinking Nick in particular, our head of video, now knows more than I think is probably healthy for any civilian to know about the Saturn V rocket and to the nearest millisecond moments within that mission that things happened. It also involved, obviously we weren't building the monument, but because we were fixated on this idea of creating the 1-to-1 scale Saturn V rocket, working very much with scale, and therefore the architecture team on, conveniently, that is a Saturn V rocket at 1-to-1 scale as illustrated on the Washington Monument. And then turning that into, I suppose, a study which allowed us to estimate numbers of people, potential locations where we need sound systems, where we need video relay, all of the kind of practical and design considerations that go beyond just what it looks like. And our senior production manager James and his production team then put together this, working with the Smithsonian, put together this sort of huge plan for how one runs an event at that scale in a public space, and that included in this event actually having the law changed. We have I think we have a bill that went through the House, signed by Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, authorizing this event to happen on the Mall, because technically these events aren't allowed and you're not allowed to project on the monument. So this is a pre-visualization. You'll hopefully agree it looks pretty much like the final thing. Something else that we do a lot of is just demonstrating what our work is going to look like, site plans and so on, and of course all of the technical and production work that was behind the scenes. So that's one manifestation of like all of the muscles of 59 coming together to create a story, a narratively motivated, live, if you like, as in there's a live audience public event on a huge scale. I'm just flipping through lots of pictures of that because I love them. And then just to bring it back again, to go full circle into the theatre. So, what we've done, as you'll notice, is we sort of go outside into the world and we get better and better and better at various things, projection mapping and building things and doing things for huge crowds and moving audience around in unusual ways. And then we bring them back into a sort of concentrated form. And Invisible Cities is one of those. It was a theatre piece. It was an adaptation of this amazing novel by Italo Calvino. And again, it's like putting human characters in the middle of a sort of theatrical imperative, which is telling this very ephemeral story. I don't know if those who know the book, it's a beautiful book, but it's very poetic, and it's about civilizations. It travels through time. It's about how nations and individuals interact with each other or fail to. It's about humanity's impact on the natural world and on each other, societies and cultures and so on each other. So we've got at the heart of it Kublai Khan, the Mongolian emperor, who's rooted to the ground, who's sort of stone and earth. And then we've got Marco Polo, the Venetian explorer. And the book imagines this series of conversations between them in which Kublai Khan is seeking, I suppose, on some level, an understanding of the world and his empire and the thing that he controls and owns. And Marco is showing him these ephemeral glimpses of the impossibility of owning and knowing such things. And we tackled that by taking it into a non-theatrical space, highly dramatic, but not a theatre, which is this amazing venue in Manchester. It's the first venue. It's subsequently toured. And using essentially wiping clean the audience relationship to the piece question, like saying, we don't know that the audience is going to be sitting on one side watching this through a proscenium arch or whatever. What we know is that the audience needs to pertain to the piece in a different way. We also applied, I suppose, design principles, if you like, to the dramaturgy of it. So we commissioned an adaptation by Lalita Chakrabarti, amazing writer, and she and I sort of dramaturgically pulled the book apart and put it back together, and we used our design tools in the studio. And in fact, I had a number of designers work on this with me, this kind of narrative map, which allowed us to sort of pull out the textual fragments and the dialogue and some of the descriptions of the many, many cities that are described, and put together, as I say, I mean, I think a map is the clearest word. This is basically the whole show on one page. that manifested ultimately into the final piece. So again, sort of applying design principles to pulling apart and delivering a narrative. And I'll just flash through some of the sort of work in progress shots of this. So the principles of the staging on the right there are, in the end, that we would split the stage up into compass points. It was all about travel and journeys and direction and circumnavigating the globe and so on. And we would put the audience also on 4 sides into the kind of corners of that. So radically change the normal audience relationship to a piece by bringing them sort of into the landscape of it. We're also going to use both considerable amounts of projection, changing the dynamic by bringing these gauzes down in front of the 4 blocks of audience to make a much smaller space, but also by using real, tangible, real world things like water. You see the canal bottom left there, which we did. This is the architectural design that Jenny, our head of architecture and the scenic designer for this, sort of resolved on in the end. So 4 seating blocks, gauzes that come in and out in front of those seating blocks, a huge built stage. This turned out to be quite a challenge, as you can imagine. A canal filled with real water, a canal covering, which is then dynamically removed over the course of the show. And then these big scenic pieces that we call the doors that were sort of on the northeast southwest, where Marco would kind of go off on his journeys and then re-enter through. Bit of technical drawing there because everyone loves one of those, but I mean, again, the skills of the studio go from the sort of design right the way through to technical drawing and so on. So using all of those skills, and actually, again, just touching back on VR because it's a tool we're using more and more. We did a lot of pre-visualization of this show in VR because the possibility of spatially manifesting it in, say, a model form was very complex because it was closed effectively, and it was very hard actually for quite a lot of our potential partners. So the people who are amazing co-producers from around the world, we were able to put them into the VR and say, this is the show in your venue. And then these are a sort of selection of things. Top left is the sketch of the scenic piece. Middle left is actually a pre-visualization. It's a 3D render. And then, as you can see on the right there, that's a production photograph. And again, we've sort of stopped being, or I've forced myself to stop being amazed by this because it's starting to get embarrassing. But the team are extraordinarily good at creating something in pre-visualization that looks like the final piece now. It got a bit boring to go into theatre and be like, wow, that looks just like we thought it was going to look. But that is sort of testament to their skill. And then huge amounts of video design, again, that sort of spans loads of different areas of both sort of filmic, cinematic video design that goes on these huge gauze screens, but also is projection mapped into the space. So the physical space is radically transformed from scene to scene through the use of projection, as per many of our other shows as well. And I have to say, working with the most extraordinary group of dancers and choreographer, Sidi Labi Chikawi, to make the dancers both part of the architecture and the cities, but also expressions of the characters and sort of echoes of the characters themselves. And ultimately, those dancers become, I suppose, in a way, the myriad inhabitants of a multicultural, multi-ethnic world. And the sort of final image of the show is all of the audience with all of the dancers on the outside of the stage, looking down at the globe with sort of Kublai Khan in the middle of it. Yes, and there's a rubbish dump. So, and I'll sort of leave you with the final couple of wide shots of that piece. So there you are, Glenn. I hope that's not too. It's a bit of a whirlwind tour. I knew I was going to push it with that many slides. But
what a journey! That was an amazing transit through so many different projects that touch on so many aptitudes and visionary aesthetic approaches that your firm has. 59 is really is the total, is the Gesamtkunstwerk made real, really. I think.
Well, I'm glad you said it, not me.
Yeah.
It's incredibly arrogant, and I don't feel it's quite true, but one has to have, I suppose, to some extent, some form of ambition for where it's going, and pushing design as far as it can go in as many directions as we can dream, I suppose, is maybe one version of that.
So Leo, I think we actually have more questions in the chat box than I've ever seen on this program before. So we have quite a few to get through. But
Well, I'm available.
I'm going to exploit my privilege to ask you a first question, which is just that it struck me. It was actually when you showed an image of the Edinburgh Festival and you saw all the people holding their phones up, taking the picture of the thing that you had made, that and the fact that you had already generated those images through technological study and effect or interactivity with singers, that there's a sense in which what 59 is doing is also staging a different kind of story, which is the story of technology itself, and the story of technology almost having an internal conversation where you have devices overlapping, almost like tidal waves, building on one another. And I wonder to what extent you feel like the practice is necessarily shifting because of changes in technology, and also in some ways providing the public with an aesthetic articulation of where technology is in our time.
Well, it's interesting because we talk a lot about hiding the technology. And I suppose we would always say, to date, that the technology needs to really, unless it's about technology, which, I suppose narratively our pieces rarely are directly, the technology has to kind of disappear. However, in this world in which we're all looking at each other in little squares and trying to imagine a world in which we're not all looking at each other in little squares, but also not crammed into dark boxes very close to each other, I think we are, or I am at least, having to get over some of my own squeamishness about technology as a subject in its own right. And so finding the site-specific, if you like, or medium-specific elements of any digital platform, for example, feels like an enormous exploration that we need to go on at this point, actually. I mean, I've forced myself into VR, having really just sort of failed to engage with it, really entirely my own fault recently, amongst other things, and sort of excited about viewing some of these new works that really started to come out in the last couple of days, even, like really, really well, high production value live concerts, high production value online, I suppose site-specific theatre and things like that. So we've been able to get away with for a long time saying, no, it's not technology. We're not doing it because of technology. We are doing it because of story, and we're applying design as a process to that. If technology is one of the tools we use to realize that, then so be it. And I think maybe those times are over. I think we need to take it more seriously, as you suggest.
Interesting. Okay. Well, let's go to some of the audience questions. As I say, we have quite a few. So first, we'll go to Ana Inez Jalares Pita. Ana, are you there? And if not, I can just read the question, which maybe I'll do. Okay. The question from Ana is, Leo, how did you grow from working just yourself to creating a multi-art company, I guess a large company that keeps growing? So can you talk a little bit about the expansion of the firm and what your role is?
Yeah, I mean, two corrections on that. Thank you, Anna. First of all, it was never just me, except very brief, very dark moments when people sort of temporarily, thank heavens, left, and then in some cases came back or new people joined. But I've never done good work on my own, and I set actually a sort of predecessor company, 59 Design, coming out of university in 2001, and I set that up with one of the now fellow directors, Anna, who did go away for over 10 years and has now rejoined the board. And I set it up specifically because I wanted to try, again, naively, to try and hold together people of like radically different voices, different, because of different interests, different skills, different backgrounds, and so on. I was excited about collaborative work from the beginning. And so I was never entirely on my own. It certainly became more of a multi-headed beast when Mark and Lysander, also two directors, joined sort of 2005, 2006. And we worked much more as a team then, as a regular team, and we just, by necessity, the scale of the work we were doing meant we had to add to that team. And because I think we were asking a huge amount of the people we were working with, we felt ultimately, and this took several years before we were in a position to do this, but felt ultimately that if we were going to be subsuming to some extent their artistic practice and their professional practice into our own, we damn well needed to be in this together. And so, we've tried wherever we possibly can to offer an opportunity to bring people to be part of, I suppose, what I'm increasingly calling, like it or not, the family.
But it's almost like an artistic collective then.
Well, it isn't, because my definition of a collective is something where, there's a loose affiliation of people who mutually support and work together frequently, but they do produce work under their own names. We don't do that. We produce work under 59. We credit the team within, the full team, everyone who's involved in a project. And indeed, that's something we've had to get better at over the years, but I'm still getting better at. But we try to credit everyone who's involved in everything. But it's not inherently, we never purely take individual credit.
Right.
And the other thing, in terms of something which is growing, I mean, we are trying, we are, our business plan, if you like, and COVID has affected it, but it shouldn't change this, which is that we're not trying to grow any more, really. I think there are key areas we know we need to expand in, but we're not planning an exponential growth. Like, we are planning a soft landing, I think it's termed in sort of management consultancy speak.
Well, we actually have another question from Roisin Martindale, which is precisely about the impact of the present moment. Roisin, would you like to ask your question directly?
Hi.
Hi.
I had to go back up to read the question.
It's a good question. So
it was excellent, whatever it was.
You refer, yes.
So my question is just kind of about theatre and theatre performance specifically. Obviously, theatre is in a pretty bad state right now. A lot of our theatre buildings are closed and we don't know when they're going to be opening again. But I know there's been a lot of conversations between theatre makers kind of asking big existential questions about what theatre is right now and what it might look like in the near future. So I just wondered if you feel that there's any possibilities or areas that you think are particularly exciting in this moment in time.
Yeah, that is a great question. I mean, yes, I absolutely do think there are areas I'm excited about. Whether the rest of the world is excited about them, I don't know. I mean, I suppose things like the events that we've done, Go for the Moon and so on, which to some extent is theatrical production, although admittedly there's no live performers in it, and perhaps more pertinently, Invisible Cities, in which we sort of said, no, we, in spite of strong suggestion and advice from our executive producers and co-producers to the contrary, we said we really couldn't conceive of originating it in a traditional theatre. It was we were offered some very nice traditional theatres. For whatever reason, I could not wrap my head around how we would do that. Whereas taking not a blank space, I mean, the venue was like quite the opposite of blank, but it was not a theatrical space, and building our own version of an audience relationship to the performance into that was really, I felt like, set us as a company off on a whole new way of exploring audience relationships to performance. And so, I very much hope that the theatres that are currently closed are going to survive and find ways of doing that both in the short term and the long term. And I have perhaps a perverse confidence in the resilience and imagination of the industry. I know it's already gone pretty badly wrong for some very close collaborators and friends of ours. So that is probably misplaced optimism to some extent. However, that aside, I do think there are really interesting explorations that we can go on as a company and as an industry to explore new areas for theatre, however you might want to define that. And I suppose I don't use the theatre word as much as I might do. I tend to talk about performance or show or experience, less the latter actually, because I think it doesn't mean anything necessarily. But you know, we've done work outdoors. We've done a lot of work outdoors. We've done work in really unusual spaces. We've done work where people really couldn't get any closer to each other than several meters, even if they wanted to. So yeah, I think it's about, like, finding the site-specific elements of a medium or a platform like VR or like online or like TV or, you know, whatever it is. I think there are maybe site-specific or medium-specific things that can be worked out for a moment in time as well. Like, what are the possibilities of the time that we are in all sorts of different ways. I don't know what the answer to that is. I think some people way smarter than I am will come up with better answers before I do. Some of them, well, I hope, may well be in 59. Many of them certainly won't be. So yeah, I think there is huge possibility amidst much sort of turmoil and sadness. But yeah.
I will say, it seems like 59 has come a long way on unwarranted optimism. So I'm just going to take two more questions. Usually we like to go in order, but there's so many that I'm going to zero in on a couple that touch on topics that we haven't addressed. So one is from Richard Henley, which is a really interesting question about collage. Richard, are you there?
Hi.
Hey, Richard.
Yeah, my question was, I always think of your work as a kind of contemporary iteration of collage because it uses so many different kind of visual mediums. I just wondered if that's something that resonates with you or if you take particular inspiration from that medium.
That's a very good question. I have never thought of it as collage because I think maybe the sort of, you know, frustrated graphic designer in me doesn't allow me to think quite so much of seeing the edges. That's probably a very naive image I have in my head of collage. But I suppose collage, by my definition, probably celebrates the joins between the slightly imperfect joins between different elements, and maybe to some extent my perfectionism doesn't allow me to do that quite so much. I definitely think that finding the right element from disparate sources or disparate, I don't know, voices, areas, places in the world is critical and exciting and interesting. And I'm certainly much more interested in that than like a homogeneous design approach to anything. I wouldn't use the word collage, but that doesn't mean it's not right.
Okay, thank you.
Interesting. And then we'll take just one last question from Radha Mohan Rajani. Do we have Radha? Okay, maybe I'll just, oh, we can't. Okay, I'll just, oh, are you there?
Yeah, I found myself.
Oh, super. Hi. Hello.
My question here is, so as a company or an organization that's so focused on the narrative, which is something you said a lot, when you're commissioned by a client that, you know, you're talking about a story that already existed, like a historical story, or a director that already has a very specific vision, how much, or if at all, and how do you play around with trying to bring that narrative closer to the audience or get the audience more involved in the narrative of the story? Like, how much space are you given, or how much space do you try to take for playing around with that kind of thing, and how to get the audience more involved or bring the story closer to them?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I mean, I think that to some extent is the difference between our self-initiated work and the work that someone comes to us with a brief or an idea. I mean, it's a bit of a gift if there is a story, because in a sense, the question of what is it already at least has a partial answer, or at least what's the idea has a partial answer. And then there is the very interesting question of like, is that a story we want to tell? And it's something which I think we're having to get a lot better at, like really answering for ourselves, like taking that question very seriously. Do we want to tell this story? Can we tell this story? Are we the right people to tell this story? And frequently we say no. I mean, even historically, but especially now. And so, but in terms of how we do it, when we do it, how we do it, I think we're agnostic about the techniques that we use. I think that thing that I talked about, admittedly rather too quickly, probably with not the best illustrations, but about how we feed that through the process of design. And really, until we start to see things, we will talk a lot. There is a lot of talk, and there's often quite a lot of writing as well, sort of whether it's because we write something ourselves, sort of re-internalize the brief, or commission a writer or a dramaturg, or just discuss in sort of creative dialogue with each other. But we'll essentially put it through the mill. We'll put it through the process of design, which for us is, as I've sort of vaguely illustrated, very wide-ranging. And in terms of bringing the audience closer to it, I mean, I think that is a lot. We're not afraid of being quite spectacular or quite big, literally, when we need to. I mean, I think, you know, we use music a lot. In fact, I can't think of a thing we've done in the last 10 years when we haven't used music. We will use music to manipulate, I think in the best possible way, people's attention, and to try and help. I mean, I use it quite a lot to try and work out what the hell I'm doing, you know, narratively, dramatically, visually. We'll almost start with the music quite often. Invisible Cities, once I did that sort of map with the design team and working with Lolita, the writer, really we then commissioned the music and then worked sort of parallels. In fact, that's it, right? Here's a better answer. It's working in a series of parallel streams. It's like we've got music, we've got, you know, architecture and physical design, we've got video and animation and live filmmaking, we've got physical staging, we've got the audience, we've got performers, we've got dance, whatever it is. And if you can run all of those things, I mean, obviously you can't do all of them every time, although in some cases we've been lucky enough to have all of those possible things open to us, then you can quite quickly start to see which one is going to speak the loudest and clearest or most effectively, and then start to weave something together. And this is maybe why I'm interested in the idea of total design as opposed to just being pigeonholed, like you do the video bit and make sure that's the best it can be, but we'll worry about everything else. It's like, then you can weave things in a way that you're handing focus and storytelling capacity back and forth between different media, which are variously different and have their own benefits and assets and whatever at different moments at telling different elements of the story. That's a very rambling answer, so it may not be very helpful.
I thought that was a brilliant way to end, actually, Leo. Unfortunately, we are at time, and it's such a rich conversation. I love that last image, though, of the interwoven strands and the kind of brightness of the story emerging out of that process of weaving. And I just want to also recall something you said earlier in the conversation, which was a definition of design that you offered, that it's the thing that crosses the existential gulf between the idea and the result, the idea and the object, the idea and the tangible. And I just thought that was such a beautiful way of thinking about it, and so extraordinarily exemplified by 59. I know that you've been speaking on behalf of many, so I also want to appreciate your spokesperson.
Yeah, I see some of the names on the grid there,
exactly.
So thank you all for thank you all for everything.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And I did want to just briefly say in announcer mode that on Monday we'll have another great guest, and this is going to be a funny one. Humor hasn't necessarily been a really strong leitmotif of our program, but we're going to introduce you to somebody, if you don't already know her, who is incredibly witty as well as incredibly intelligent and perceptive about the subject of architecture, and that's Kate Wagner, who posts to social media under the tag McMansion Hell. So you might know her under that rubric. But beyond the humor, she also just has one of the most critically acute minds working in really any critical field today. So please come back for that. And apart from that, I just want to thank you, Leo, for everything that you've done, everything 59 has done to bring so much to so many, really. I mean, the amount of pleasure and astonishment and also education and wonder that you've put out into the world is really something to behold. So congratulations on everything you've done, and good luck to you in your future projects.
Thank you to you, Glenn. Thank you very much for inviting us in.
Yeah, great to have you. Okay, thanks everyone. Have a great weekend. We'll see you Monday.